Good morning, beautiful people. And again, thank you for tuning in to another episode of The Social Mind. Today, we are discussing language oppression and linguistic discrimination in Grenada. Now, not everyone who speaks English is treated equally or the same. What do we do when we are teased, when we are made fun of, and discriminated against because of our accents by our peers, by our colleagues, by our associates, or even total strangers? Whether this discrimination occurs consciously or unconsciously, how do we avoid such biases? One of the discussions we'll be having today is about accents and one's intelligence, for example. And I have with me Dr. Lois Barker. Now, Dr. Lois Barker has over 15 years of experience in education. Her expertise is in the professional development and curriculum design. Her instructional practice is rooted in multicultural pedagogy. Dr. Barker works with educators exploring how to leverage technology to create multicultural learning processes or spaces, She has presented workshops at various conferences focused on language expression and discrimination, authentic writing, virtual coaching, and the use of picture books in the secondary classroom. Dr. Barker currently serves on the board of Texas of Teachers of English Language Arts, where she spearheads the DREAM program, a program dedicated to recruiting and mentoring pre-service teachers of color. Last year, she co-authored and published a children's book with her daughter, Ava's Caribbean ABC. Ava's Caribbean ABC serves as a node to Caribbean history and culture in an accessible, engaging manner for all ages. Dr. Barker, welcome to the Social Mind, and thank you for being part of the progress or the process for change and educating our people in a different manner.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for doing an amazing program like this. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Now, we're going to be talking about language oppression and linguistic discrimination in our country, Grenada. And one of the things that pops up a lot is accent. Now, we know that every one of us, when we're speaking, the way we sound, accent, is how we speak, the way we sound, how we use phonological features, the words we stress on, or rhythm, or tone, or intonations. And I want to associate that every one of us speaks with an accent. There is no non-accent or a non-existent of an accent. Yet when we speak in particular ways, we are put in different classes, different categories, our varying levels of intelligence are measured. Can you explain to us why intelligence and accents are linked in the Grenadian culture?
I think let me start by, I guess, clarifying some of the terminology for the listeners, just so we can transition smoothly into how it became a hierarchy, right? And so when we talk about language oppression, it's really the enforcement of language laws, right? Almost by any means necessary. So language loss is essentially forced assimilation or forced language coercion. The ruling body of people that dominate language does not give the marginalized group any option in how they acquire the language or when they acquire the language. So it's really an enforcement of language laws by physical, mental, social, and spiritual coercions. And when we think of language is one of our first entries into developing community. It's one of our first entries into understanding our identity as well as our cultural identities. And so when we enter language oppression, the marginalized group or the group being colonized, essentially what the message is sending is that your native tongue, your mother tongue, is not of value.
It's not good enough.
The ruling party's language, that mainstream language, is the one that holds the power, the one that wields all the social currency. And so language oppression, it's really rooted in xenophobia. It's rooted in racism. And it stems from ideology that supports the idea that, or this golden rule, that there is one formal way of speaking a language. So in our case, it's English, right? So it stems from the idea that there is this golden standard of English. And if your linguistic behavior or your speech patterns don't align with this golden rule or this standardization of the language, then you're less than, right? And so the hierarchy steps in. We need to think of language oppression as not just, oh, well, they colonized us, so we had to communicate with them. But because of language oppression, many indigenous tongues were extinct or on the verge of becoming
extinction. Right?
Yeah. Yes. And a lot of the formal languages we know, except in the Caribbean, like French, English, Spanish, Dutch, they're not native. They are the colonizers' language. And so they were, in a sense, forced upon the people who are already here and the people who were brought here from Africa. And so, just keep that in mind, the forced assimilation, the forced acquisition of a language. And in our context, you had indigenous peoples already here speaking their own languages. You had enslaved Africans from various parts of West Africa and other parts of the continent speaking right. their own languages. And so they had to find a way to communicate for survival because they're in this strange new place. So they had to learn how to communicate for survival. So you have a meshing of their language. In some islands, that meshing joined indigenous language, and then you had the forced language upon them. And that's how we get our different, we have our Creole, French-based Creole, that's common in St. Lucia, Dominica, Haiti, and one point us. And then you have the vision, like the varying patois, and all of these languages stem from people trying to communicate, people trying to survive, while at the same time acquiring the colonizer's language, right? And so that led to linguistic discrimination. And so linguistic discrimination is when a person is treated differently because of their language use, right? So we're talking about their use of their native language. We're talking about their accents, their dialects, and how all of that plays into how they speak this mainstream English or the Queen's English. Well, what we say now, the King's English. I don't know how we would phrase it, but English. Right. And so a lot of this discrimination shows up, like you mentioned earlier, when we tease people, when you enter some spaces where we have things like English only policies, or you have a lot of practices in our classrooms where kids are constantly shamed for speaking a certain way or sounding and writing a certain way, but in all actuality, they're using language that is native to them. And if two or more people can understand you, then there's nothing wrong with
There's effective communication. Exactly.
It is a form of communication. And so what we have to be mindful of, especially in Grenada, is that, like, you go to different parts of the region and we all, yes, we have a common dialect, we share common words, but the accents might vary. And we have to think about why that is. What socialization look like in different parts of the island. We have to think about which parts of the island were exposed to more trade or more interactions with colonizers and the desire to sound more like them versus other parts of the island where you had more sort of plantation work happening and access to education. Well, how would that sound? Because your exposure to a language, how you're taught the language, your opportunities to practice the language impacts how that comes out and how that sounds. So going back to that original question, the social hierarchy, of our accents and our language. When we see someone's accent and dialect, it often, like when we hear it, it legit determines their social status, right? We begin to have all these assumptions that if you are farther away from the Queen's English, then you have certain deficits. And it is not, I don't want to say it's our fault for thinking that way, because we've been conditioned to think that way for numerous, for numerous reasons. And so, who said it? It was James Baldwin who said that language is a political instrument, right? It means the means of it, and it's a proof of power. It's most vivid and a crucial key to identity. It reveals private identity. And there have been times and places to speak a certain language could be dangerous and fatal. He also said in one of his essays that sometimes when a man opens up his mouth, you get his educational status, you get his financial status, and all other things that come along with that. And I think for us, and not just in Grenada, I have seen this here in America as well, that when you sound further away from the mainstream language, people assume that you're not intelligent. Because if you were intelligent, then you would know how to speak properly.
Yeah.
Your diction, your vocabulary bank would be more expanded. They would assume that, so because you're not intelligent because of how you sound, then your financial status must be at the lower end of the spectrum, because who would hire you? And who would put you in a place of position sounding like that, talking like that, reading. And writing like that? So where does that stem from? Colonialism. The British in America and everywhere they ruled, especially after the American Revolution, they made it a point to ensure everybody under their rule, you had to be close to their version of whiteness, their idea of standard English, their idea of civilized living. And so you bring that into schools, you bring that into churches, you bring that into other avenues. Think about our schools, like how you're drilled and killed to speak a certain way, how you are forced to write a certain way. When you look at our laws and policies and how people respond to emails, yes, they laugh at us in America. Oh, y'all Americans are too brief and informal, but we communicate clearly and on a level so everyone can understand. But then you look at some of our jargon, it's very colonial. It's very dated. And why is that? Because of that proximity to whiteness, that proximity to power, because that's what the elders were taught. When you sound and you act a certain way, it's social currency. And so things will open up for you. And I think that's why we have the constant, if you sound too country, you get teased. Or if you sound too proper, you get teased because
you think you're better than people. Yeah,
you're coming up here talking fancy, and so it's a torn thing. This back and forth thing that just, it really stems from colonialism, when language was weaponized and used to divide and things of that nature.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much for that detailed explanation in terms of talking about the hierarchy, because we know in some societies, and as you just mentioned, in certain parts in Grenada, certain accents are more accepted than others, and persons, as you rightfully say, they experience discrimination. How can we address those issues? Since we're talking about language, is a natural part of who we are, is something that is our part of our heritage, is something that has been handed down to us. And when we are forced to speak the king or the queen's language, because I'm not certain which one we're using, right? But when we are forced to use what we now call standard English, to put it more simplistically, how do we get there? How do we move from that transition to the next. And I also noticed that you mentioned patois, which in the Grenadian context again, that seems to be non-existent. There are few persons still around who can speak that language, but it's dying. That is part of our cultural, the expression of our history and our cultural identity. How do we get there to really fully accept that part of who we are? And I totally understand that we need to be able to code switch when we're in different spaces. So yes, the standard English is necessary. But how do we get to the stage where we are not teasing or making fun of each other, but we understand that's his socialization, that's the part that he's from, and that's also unique, and also makes that part of the community or the persons within that community who they are? How we not take our dialect in a negative way? I suppose that's what I'm asking.
I think it starts with a lot of like education, right? A lot of learning. I am from Granbra. I went to St. Joseph Convent, Grenville, and I went to St. Andrew's RC. And when I was there, I mean, I left Grenada in '99, so a lot has changed, right? But I keep in touch and I do my research. But when I was there, we had fine arts festivals. We had, different debate opportunities. And at that time, a lot of events and certain things were always done.
I think I know where you're going in the
town schools,
in St.
right?
George's area. I think I know where you're going.
Yeah, we always had to be bused there. And yeah, we were happy for the field trip. We were excited to be a part of a debate. We were excited to be a part of fine arts. But when we were there, it was always the well, you ain't hear they go talk. They must lose the debate because them country children, they ain't smart. You ain't hear us talk. They can't speak English right. Who go understand them in the debate? And I didn't have the language for it at the time. I didn't have the education to know what was happening. Linguistic discrimination. I didn't know these things, right?
Right.
And so as a child, I am annoyed. I'm pissed off. Like, well, why they make, like, we all Grenada. We all speak in the same English. So we're talking about, you better than me. You can't understand what I say. You know what I'm saying? And so at that age, you started feeling not a hatred, because that's a strong word, but you started feeling some type of way every time you had to go in certain parts of the island, because you already, those people already placed themselves in a hierarchy because of how they sounded and how much access they had to different things and so on and so forth. And then when I moved to this country, the same thing started happening. Oh, you probably need ESL because I don't think your English. You sure this is English? Because I have no idea what you're saying. And that was the thing. And then I did not want to lose my accent, but I realized that whatever context you're in, until people become more and more educated, or until you feel strong enough in yourself,
your conviction, right?
Yeah, like to speak in that language, code switching became a thing. I had to learn, and in my head, I thought I was doing a really good job of code switching to the American accent until I started teaching, and my kids were like, Miss, no. You sound very Caribbean. You're not doing what you thought you was doing. But anyways, code switching allowed me to be heard and in the most part to be taken seriously, which is very,
important.
It's very important, but it's very sad, right? Sad. Like I can't speak like this to be taken seriously. And so in spaces in non-Caribbean spaces where I'm allowed, in a sense, and I hate saying allowed to, but where I feel comfortable to speak how I speak and use my words and be understood and no one questioning what you're saying. In those spaces, people are, they've done the work. They've done the research to understand that people sound differently. Language has no bearing on one's intelligence. They've done the work to get to know where I come from, and they understand that people in different regions in the Caribbean will sound like me. We speak English, but how we say the words, how we structure our sentences will be different because of our own dialect. Some of the terminology I will use will be different because of British influence, and because we still have Creole words in that it's not slang, it's legit Creole words.
Exactly.
Spanglish, people speak Spanglish. If we put more Creole in there, Creolish, like we'll have a nice mesh
of language,
English and Creole, right?
Yeah.
So
we can create our language, yeah.
Exactly. And so going back to code switching is social currency, and that's a thing people have to get comfortable with until, like, depending on what you're trying to do and where you're trying to go. And it's not, it feels hypocritical to be authentic to yourself. Nothing is wrong with your accent. But then here I am saying code switch. But sometimes you have to code switch because then you're meeting a wall until people, the masses, understand that.
Start to understand.
How we speak our English is influenced by other languages, and we need to have informal learning opportunities for people to dive into linguistics, right? And understanding culture and linguistics, understanding politics and linguistics, because if you ever hear people who acquire English, some of the words will sound differently because of that native tongue. So our ancestors had various African native tongues. Some of them had indigenous tongues. And then again, they originally started learning French. And so you have that mesh, like that the different sounds of the language happening. And then you put English on top of that. And so it's going to sound some type of way. It will never sound like the original people from England. And the thing about it is, even when you go to England, they have different accents and they have different dialects. So it's why are we forcing our people to adhere to some standard when you go over there, the standard ain't the same all across the place. Same thing in America. Like if you listen to New York State, you listen to someone in Brooklyn, they sound totally different to someone from Buffalo, Rochester, and the higher up you go.
And the South, yeah.
Same thing in Texas. I am in Texas, right? You go to North Texas, they sound way different from someone in South Dallas than someone in Houston or El Paso or whatever. So there's a lot of things around language that is missing from formal education and informal education. And we as a people, don't hate me, we don't like to self-interrogate. And for us to be more accepting of our language and inclusive, we have to do some self-interrogation, ask this question that we probably used to get beat for in class. Why? Right? Why do we speak this way? Where did it come from? Why do we often tend to do this versus that? I feel it's a cop-out when we respond, well, so we did. We always doing things. So what you trying to do? Or you go on, there's this uneasiness when we talk about, well, why? How let's do some research around it.
Let's discuss this, yeah.
Yeah, let's discuss it. And so as a people, we need to dive into more informal learning. Everything doesn't have to happen in school, but informal learning. Asking our remaining elders, why didn't you, teach me Creole or Patois, however we want to call it, right? And so, and the sad part is some of the reasons were we don't want y'all to know what we're talking about.
So we business, yeah.
A whole language business. Because, but there's one theory that was passed down to them because Creole or Patois was part of Fedor's rebellion, right? So you had the meshing of language. And to be able to survive against the wrath of the British, you can't be out there talking in English. So this was this secretive, protective language, and they could not necessarily talk it open, out there because after Fedon's rebellion, and coupled with the American Revolution, the British came down really hard on their colonies, like
absolutely
tyrants, right? And so there was a secretive nature around Creole, El Patois, and I feel like that's one of the reasons why it stayed that way. And so I feel like, my great grandmother and my grandmother, we're not going to teach you all that because we're talking about stuff we don't want y'all to do. And I think it stems from that. And they didn't ask why. They just kept on
it's just
doing
it's just the way it was, and they just kept on.
So we did,
correct,
right? And now it's on the verge of extinction, if not gone, right? Yeah. So again, just we need to engage in more conversations. We need to ask why, when did this start, how did it start, and just be open that what you thought was the truth or what you were told to be true may not always be that thing, because our education is shaped on, the colonial system, and those powers will shape your learning how they see fit, because they have, they want to maintain power. They have ulterior motives, so.
Here we are. Something that you touched on in terms of the creolization with the English words mixing with the French. One of the things that we say when we communicate is like, so we say yes twice, or I di go, we di go, she di go, I di day, he di day, or the new thing now, where they di day, right? And we understand that when we communicate with each other, we understand it very clearly. But sometimes, as you say, when we move out from our communities and go into different spaces, the discrimination sort of creeps in. I guess the segregation sort of creeps in. So my final question to you, Dr. Barker, how do we end that linguistic discrimination and create a more inclusive, functional use of language to benefit not just the native, but the non-native speakers in our Grenadian context?
Schooling needs to change, right? How we engage with learning in the classroom needs to change. I know when I was there, you would talk with your peers how you want to talk, but then when you had to go collect an award or introduce the school, then you had to code switch. I think explaining social currency to kids, to parents, to individuals, it goes a long way. On this, allowing children and just individuals to, to understand what social currency is with the code switching. So something I would do in my classroom, because there's this movement, at one point in America, you have African American English, right? I would tell my students, when we talk to me how that, you feel most comfortable with. My job is to understand your context. My job is to remove my biases, this is not proper English, or clearly they're not intelligent, or clearly they're not reading, clearly they're talking in slang. I have to remove these assumptions, and I have to listen in order to understand, right? Don't listen to question, don't listen to correct. And so that's one thing that needs to start happening, is explaining that there's ways that you speak and there's nothing wrong with that, because in your community, that's your social currency, right? That's who you truly are. We need to find opportunities to celebrate that in writing, creative writing, in speech, in monologues, in performances, because there's something called, and I'm not sure about the learning standards in Grenada, but here we have something called author's voice. How does the author reveal their personality? Well, if I song like this, and if I would say, hey, girl, where you going? And I'm writing a personal narrative or a story about some event in my life, me saying, and Lois asked Trisha, hey, girl, where you go?
Where are you going?
I would never be like, hey, girl, where you going? That's how I would say it.
It loses its essence.
It's really important to allow kids to write in their voice, find books, find these learning materials that will allow them to see it and feel like, yes, here's this published person. They talk just like me. They don't need subtitles or whatever, right? They sound like me. But also, in the same token, telling them that sometimes in other settings, people are not used to hearing it. And so there'll be a communication block until they get more comfortable. So you may have to code switch, right? You may have to, slow down how you speak, because some of us talk rapid fire.
Really fast, yeah.
You may have to restructure your sentences just a little bit so they understand. And when you take a test, when you write for CXC, there is a certain type of way they expect to see it, and this is how you do the thing. So showing them value in different parts of it and allowing them to express it without judgment goes a very long way. And it starts in the education system, and same thing with employers. And when we have outsiders coming in, again, they know they come into a different place. They already know it's going to be a different accent, different dialect. And so, if we can code switch. If we can't, just removing assumptions, removing biases, and just learning how to be effective communicators. But we have to get away from, the teasing and the making fun of it, because, yes, that's what we do as a people, and we're like, oh, you're too soft, get a hard back. But there over time, when you normalize certain behaviors, you don't see the harm in it, and then you kind of hinder progress. And so, that hinders us from really exploring our cultural identity in terms of language, and how we can expand our idea of language
and fully express ourselves.
Exactly.
And fully express ourselves. Yeah. Thank you so much for that detailed explanation, Dr. Black. I mean, while you spoke, I was able to relate to every aspect in our culture as a Grenadian growing up in our culture. I too was teased from how I spoke. You said you came from the country. I left the St. George's and went to the country, and I was teased because I had a different accent. I did speak differently from my peers at the time, my cousins, my uncles. We all spoke differently, and I was teased. It's like, where you take it from? You think you're American, And I was teased because I guess, I don't know. To me, I speak like a normal Grenadian, and I could understand that. I suppose wherever I go, I could have understood everything that the other person was saying. So in my mind, in my young mind, I was fine until I left St. George's and went, as we would call it, the countryside. I'm not going to name the parish. And I was teased. I was ridiculed, and I couldn't wait to get back to my comfort zone, which is in St. George's, because that's where all my other classmates and friends were. So I could relate to that aspect. Another thing that you mentioned is our educational system, and I know that I said that was my final question to you. How do you think we can get there as a country? How do you think we can get there as individuals, as a society, where we really remove our biases and discrimination, and not thinking because somebody speaks eloquently or they're a good orator that he or she is intelligent or smart? All of us are intelligent, and we have to understand that there are very levels of intelligence. So not because I'm a good orator, you're a good speaker, right? When we make fun and we ridicule adults or children, it takes a psychological effect on impact. And so we become shy, we become reserved, and we cannot truly express who we really are. How do we get there?
We that's a loaded one, because there's so many things that we need to examine in order to get to a certain spot, right? I think we need to embrace people who want to help us decolonize the culture, if you will. And the indigenous people in Canada and America, they use the word decolonize a lot, right? Decolonizing their culture. And it's a very important concept because a lot of the things we accept as tradition were given to us.
Absolutely.
And, like when we look, again, this language was given to us. Our school setup was given to us, uniforms, the way we discipline, all those things stem from colonialism. And it's a form of control, right?
All it was control.
But because we've had it for so long and no one questioned, or the masses didn't question like why or how or why is this still necessary? Why is this still a thing? It's become tradition. It's become who we are. So we did. And it's a struggle to start unpacking lots of things, right? And then we have the mindset that when you start asking those questions and you start trying to change things, there is this divisiveness, especially if you're not there. Well,
you're disrupting the status quo.
Exactly. You don't live here. Why you coming and tell us things? Or you go abroad and you study, and all of a sudden. But again, the more you know, the better you can become, right? So, like, when you know better, do better.
Do better.
And so, we need to really adopt that mindset. When you know better, you do better. We have to start really examining what does it mean to be Grenadian. What is Grenadian history? What is Grenadian culture? What things influence Grenadian culture, right? So like in the 1400s, 1498, when we was established, or quote unquote, and the French came, what did the French bring? What did the enslaved Africans bring? What are some things left over by the Kalinago people? Like, what are some things that are truly innovative, truly beneficial, and will push us to be a more productive people that we should be keeping? And then what are some things that were in place as forms of control? Things that were in place that kept us closer to whiteness, closer to the British, than really closer to understanding that we kind of like a mixture of things, but at the root of this mixture is that African spirit, right? Like, it's really hard for us to be like, well, we're going back to Africa. Well, where exactly in Africa are you going back to? And even if you say I'm going back to Ghana, Ghana has different tribes, there's different traditions, cultures. So that part of our identity was stripped away from us by the French, by the British. But the more you learn, the more you research, what do we want to keep, what's beneficial to us, and how we keep pushing. And again, starting with language, how do we own our dialect and our accents, and we take pride in that. And it starts home. We as communities from different parishes, we have to love each other and respect our differences first before we can even ask outsiders to not ask us twice, but what you're saying, like, do you speak, like those types of things. We have to do that first. And again, it's a lot of self-interrogation as a school system, or just like teachers, period, or community leaders. If you don't know, go find.
So you don't know.
Yeah.
So you don't know, and go do your research.
I don't know.
And it's okay to not know.
Yeah, and Grenada, we have a lot of experts, but people don't tap into the experts, or if the experts are not home, then you kind of feel far removed, and it's okay to reach out. I think like there's this idea that sometimes when you go abroad, you have no interest in helping, but people genuinely want to help. People genuinely want to see your homeland do better, and just flourish and be great and be a model, right? Like I always say, I feel like we supposed to be like the top-notch Caribbean island. Like, I just feel like we have so much richness, so much power that, comes from Grenada, and resources and things we could tap into as a small island that should be like the model,
I agree with you.
We have some work to do, and it starts with, interrogating what we consider as tradition and culture and being open to change, being open to unlearning and trying
And
new things.
relearning.
Yeah. Like I always use my dad as an example. My dad is 80 something years old and he got his first iPhone, a year or so ago. And at 80 something, you would think like he was very set in his ways, his little notebook writing down note. Nobody could send memes and texts now more than that man. At
My
80
mother.
something, willing to change. Yeah. And he as a parent, he has even apologized for certain ways we were disciplined or certain beliefs he had because he's reading now, he's listening to different things, and he's like, whoa, yeah, that wasn't productive. That stemmed from a dark place. That was a form of, colonialism that we should have not carried over into parenting or whatever. And that's growth. That's progress. And if he could do it at 82, 83, a lot of us could do it.
Absolutely. You raise a very important point, but this show is not a very long show. So I would just wrap it up a little bit. But before we go, I wanted to highlight that one of the most important or glorious thing that happened through colonialism and slavery in our part of the world is that a new emergence of a group of people. Nowhere in the world you can find the mixture that you would find in our part of the world, due to the mixing of the black and the white, the indigenous peoples and the Africans, the enslaved Africans. And so that new group of us came. And as you rightfully said, there is so much beauty and skills and talent within us that if we only get the space that we can harness, and I do agree with you 100% that Grenadians can really rise to the top and be the best of the best. Now, this is my nationalism coming out. I'm not a patriotic person. I'm very nationalistic. So, Dr. Barker, thank you so much for being here and sharing that wealth of knowledge and information with my guest. And be my guest, and the audience. But before you leave, is there anything that you would like to share with us that I suppose that you think that would really impact our life positively, whether it's through language, whether it's through our culture, whatever it is?
We need to read more. Like reading opens up so many avenues. And I'm not saying go find a textbook on linguistics and start reading the textbook, but like a lot of people have access to technology because a lot of places don't have public libraries in Grenada, and that's a whole other conversation.
Right.
But a lot of us have a lot of access to technology, and it's really we need to first, like in your first episode where you talked about digital citizenship, and like we really need to be mindful of where we go find information and being critical consumers, right? Just because you find something online and the person sounds legit doesn't mean
it's correct.
Yeah, do your due diligence, right? But I feel like we need to really read more, find a curiosity in reading and listening to podcasts and different things. But there's a wealth in connection that once, like, not just learning about who we are, but learning about our sister countries. When you look at what happened in Haiti with French versus Creole, it's the same thing for us with English and Creole. So like we have a lot of connectedness, if you will. And so we need to like just read up on other islands, talk to, like, if you can't afford to travel everywhere, talk to people, read online, and just start finding ways to connect. We often lean towards what makes us different. But when you have to start seeing how we connect and how people move. Yeah, like when you start seeing similarities in structures and how one island overcame structures, then you start getting empowered because like, well, we quite similar. And if they could do it, we could do it too, right?
Absolutely.
So that's the one thing I want to leave us with is like go out there, explore, read, listen to podcasts, right? But of course, make sure it's legit stuff, and figure out ways to make yourself better and your community better.
All right, thank you so much again, and And to my audience, thank you for tuning into The Social Mind. I want you to go like the page, share, comment, share your feedback, what you want us to probably discuss. And for our next episode of The Social Mind, I will be discussing that of culture and how we take or how we connect, I suppose, old ideas with new ideas, and how we let our own culture slip away because we are gravitating to other things. So thank you guys for tuning in. Thank you, Dr. Barker, for being my guest today. And I see you guys next week for another episode of The Social Mind.
To the girl in English class, what is funny? What is hilarious about my painful attempt to communicate in a language that is not even my own? See, this accent tells a story of survival. Tells how my mother tongue endured to this day, so I expect you treat my tongue with some respect. Every word, every syllable I utter comes from a riot within. My mouth is a babble between subconscious tongue, teeth, and vocal cord. So excuse you if my speech does not suit you. So this speech comes from this slaughterhouse I call a mouth. See, my mouth is a battlefield. A clash of unyielding cultures, warring for dominance. See, my tongue is a traumatized survivor. Lost in this alien fluency. See, this accent is how I find my way home. How I say idikpi without biting my tongue. See, my tongue is forever at war with itself. Forever fighting to decolonize itself. Fighting to lose and regain itself all at the same time. So cut me some slack. I will not be ashamed nor refrain from saying my name. And no, I will not apologize for my mother's legacy. For there is no dignity in denying my identity. So to the girl in English class, it's about time you learn my own language too.